Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 23rd. And as you know, today is the day in which your paper is due if you are watching this on the 23rd. And if you haven't already done so, I ask that you send that to me via PDF, which is how my grading program works best, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. We are transitioning out of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde into Dracula. And as you know, Dracula is probably the most iconic text of the texts that we will be working with this semester. It seems to be appropriate that it falls right around the ending of October, Halloween time. And I wanted to talk a little bit just about the mythology associated with Dracula. Dracul, the son of the devil, was a cruel Romanian medieval conqueror who would impale his victims. And Bram Stoker was inspired by that to name his vampire Dracula, and that was probably one of the most brilliant things that he could do. There are numerous woodcuts that will show, for instance, Vlad the Impaler, as he was known, um, dining with his impaled victims, impaled on swords and stakes around him, lots of woodcuts and so forth. And there was also a serial killer by the name of Countess Bathory in the 1500s who would reputedly bathe in the blood of her young female victims in order to have eternal life. When you merge those two ideas together, you get the very iconic Dracula. That, and if we go all the way back to the beginning of the semester, and you'll remember we talked about the evening in which Mary Shelley and her companions had dared one another to ghost stories. And Mary Shelley that evening had dreamt of the great creation scene in Frankenstein. Well, one of her companions, the Dr. Polidori, wrote in response to that competition a short story called The Vampire. And it's thought that that too influenced Dracula. So there have been long-standing accounts of either vampires or vampiric creatures. The first, or one of the first in the United States, would be 1793 Vermont, not too far from us. And if you think about what was happening during the time period where a consumption was basically ravaging the population, tuberculosis, and the symptoms would mimic very similar symptoms to what is oftentimes associated with the vampire bite: lethargy, a draining of energy, a pale complexion, things of that nature. We've already talked a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe and his fear of being buried alive, which was a somewhat legitimate, though unusual, possibility during the time period. And if you had somebody who perhaps was a victim of consumption and who perhaps had been buried prematurely and tried to work their way out of the grave, you can see that it's not much of a stretch to get to some of the folklore associated with vampires, which interestingly have existed in just about all cultures. Details are different. If you know anything about the psychic vampire, the individual who supposedly lives on the energy forces of others. So it need not necessarily be literal. And as I've been telling you over the course of the semester, Dracula is the longest of the texts. We have the most time to read it, however. And I like to think of it as four separate texts, which I think makes the reading load much easier. And I think of text one, or book one, if you will, the first four chapters. And in the first four chapters, this is when we get our vampire story. For those of you who like supernatural tales, that will be of great interest to you. And I think that's one of the ways that Stoker was quite brilliant in the way that he put all of this together, is that he basically incorporated multiple genres into Dracula. And we've talked about how oftentimes we can have genre blending in the world of the Gothic, but I suspect that one of the many reasons why his text and, of course, subsequent films have been so popular, the ability to appeal to a lot of different audience members. Because if you aren't necessarily interested in the supernatural angle, then there's book two, which is much like a romance in chapters 5 through 16. And then book three is Mina's Mystery, is what I call it, chapters 17 through 23. So if you're fond of mystery stories, you know that Edgar Allan Poe is credited with creating the first contemporary or modern day mystery story as we think of it. And then finally, book four, which would be chapters 22 to 25, is just a good old fashioned chase adventure tale. And Dracula is told, much like Frankenstein and even somewhat Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in the epistolary format. So, as we know, this was not an uncommon technique in which to storytell at the time. We've got not just letters, but we've got journal entries, newspaper clippings, things of that nature. I don't want to give away too many spoilers, so I'll wait before I get to talking a little bit about the epistolary format in further depth, because I suspect that you are just, if not finished with the novel, then you may be perhaps focused on the paper. And that said, I understand that on the day that a paper is due, that there are other demands on your time. So I wanted to keep today's lesson rather short, talk a little bit about the very iconic 1930s Universal Studios film, Dracula. And in fact, it's considered to be the first American horror film. The first horror film being The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in the 1920s, a silent film, and then Dracula. But The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a German film, great expression, or a great example of German expressionism, something that I talk about in my horror film class. And then in America in the 1930s, Dracula has the distinction of being the first. And probably one of the reasons why that film is so iconic is because of Bela Lugosi, who played the title role of Dracula. And he learned the role phonetically. So he was not fluent in English. It's one of the reasons why his speech is so stilted, and that's usually what we've come to think of in terms of vampires. This was not the first screen adaptation of Dracula. The first screen adaptation happened in the 1920s, and it's a film you might have heard of before, Nosferatu. And Nosferatu is very loosely based, or maybe not so loosely based, on Dracula. So much so that Bram Stoker's widow had basically made it her lifelong mission to have that film destroyed because of copyright violation. And she was almost successful. But thankfully for film buffs everywhere, she was not successful, and a copy continued to exist, which means that we have Nosferatu, which, much like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is a superb example of German expressionism, which is known for its distorted angles and its use of shadows, its kind of surreal imagery, the sense of the blurring between sanity and insanity, common themes that you oftentimes will find in the Gothic. And then Dracula was made into a stage play, and some of the conventions of that stage play basically transferred over to the 1930s film. So, for instance, there was a trap door in the stage so that the vampire could disappear into thin air, as vampires are reputedly able to do. And one of the conventions for that stagecraft would be that the vampire's collar, which is so iconic when we think about Dracula, and his cape would have apparatus within it so that it could stand up upright on its own, so that the actor could scurry down the trapdoor. And ultimately, what we'd be left with is an empty cape that would ultimately collapse. So that was transferred over to Dracula, because I'm sure we've got this image of what a vampire is supposed to be become so iconic that, cereals have been named after it. Count Chocula. We've got Sesame Street, utilizing the counts, as he's teaching children how to count. So you can see the image of Dracula everywhere, but probably it's much rarer to find somebody who has seen the iconic film of the 1930s that helped to lay the foundation. And even more unusual to see somebody who has actually read the novel in its entirety. One of the links I'll be sharing with you in the future is a way to read this novel over a year's time because it takes place over a year. And again, we've got journal entries and newspaper reports and so forth. Not that we have the luxury of having a year to read the novel, but reading it in real time is an experience. So you can have something sent to your inbox every day and read Dracula in that way if you so wanted to. And one of the things that is probably going to be very obvious about the 1930s Dracula film is there is no soundtrack. And I think that lends to the eeriness of the film. And of course, we're in the early days of filmmaking and in the early days of talkies. Um, you will see lots of Christian imagery here. And this is definitely a Christian text in which the message is that anything that is non Christian is considered to be other or alien. You're also going to see lots of Gothic sets. So when we talk about the idea of Gothic architecture, usually what people have in their mind is Dracula's castle, this kind of large, imposing building, the secret passageways, the dust-filled halls with spider webs, dark corners, things of that nature. Now, the film code at the time would have indicated that the monstrosity needed to be killed at the end. So this is something that we will see in the 1930s film. Again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers for the actual novel itself, so I won't talk too much about that. But it shouldn't be a surprise to you that the novel is very different than the film. If for no other reason, the novel is much longer than an hour and 15-minute film or so could relate. So there will be a condensing of characters and of plot. So I'm preparing you for watching that film next class as we get closer to Halloween. And today there is no attendance question. You're welcome. For those of you who are still working on your Dracula, or I'm sorry, who are still working on your first paper, or who are still in the midst of working on finishing up Dracula, what would be ideal, though I know the world isn't always ideal, is that you would have finished up Dracula by next week. I can happily report that I think you will find that the readings become much quicker and much more accessible after Dracula. So I think that this is probably the most challenging part of the course. And that said, it might be also one of the more interesting parts of the courses because there is a lot of action in Dracula. So while it's a longer text, I think that you will find that you will hopefully become quite immersed in the story. As I indicated, I wanted to keep today rather short for those of you who are working on your paper or still reading Dracula or doing a combination of the two. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with the 1931 version with Bela Lugosi of Dracula. Take care. Bye-bye.